So make sure that works. Yes, okay, we're recording. Welcome everyone to the INDOT CRO virtual chat. I think it's the 10th one, if I'm counting correctly. We'll have to go back and look. My name is Anthony Ross, and we've got a couple co-hosts today. Patrick Carpenter is there. Hey, Patrick. And
Hello.
Mary.
Good afternoon, everybody.
And Mary Kennedy.
Hello.
Hey, Mary. So we've got a really cool, interesting program today. A lot of stuff. First, we'll be talking about consulting party meetings, and Mary will be giving a presentation on some new guidance that we're working on, and she's taking the lead on that, and we're really excited about being able to provide some more help to consultants out there for leading effective consulting party meetings. Then Patrick will lead a discussion about the state historic review process, COAs, and going before the board, which I think will be really helpful. At the end of the session, we'll hopefully have some time to go over some quick updates on various items as time allows. So in case you're joining for the first time, the INDOT CRO virtual chats offer an informal opportunity to talk about the historic, preservation, and environmental review processes. If you're someone who practices or is affected by NEPA or Section 106, these sessions, I think, can be really useful. As always, we welcome feedback, comments, and questions. You can share them during the session or afterwards by emailing me or Patrick. So it's been a few months, been pretty busy, so busy I think we forgot our 1-year anniversary of hosting these things, which passed back in June. We're just too busy, I guess, to celebrate, but in case you're wondering, we are collecting these recordings, and I hope we're working on a way to share them effectively, and I hope to have we hope to have an update for you in the near future about sharing, about going and about providing an opportunity for you guys to go back and watch old sessions or share them with other people. So, basic ground rules, same as always. Please mute when you're not talking. Feel free to turn your camera on as you like. Post questions in the chat or raise your hand. So I think that's it. Patrick, is there anything else you want to add?
No, I think you got it covered.
All right, great.
And we're recording. Yep, I think we're good.
Good. So with that, Mary, I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks, Anthony. So as Anthony said, I'm going to talk a little bit about consulting party meetings and some guidance we're working on. I'm going to share my screen here. Hang on. And yes, I still have a landline and it's ringing, and hopefully. Okay. Sorry. Share screen. Okay, I'm totally having a moment and I'm not finding that. Okay,
That's okay.
All right, now I gotta find the, let's see.
There you go. We see it.
Okay. All right, so, except now I'm in Teams. Okay, I'm sharing from Teams, which I haven't done before on a PowerPoint. So hopefully, I'm not sure if I'm demonstrating what not to do in consulting party meetings right now. I'm just letting you all know.
This was on purpose.
Yes, this
Yeah,
is what
right.
happens when you have another meeting at 11 o'clock that goes right up to 12 o'clock and you don't have time to prep. So
That's a
anyway,
good
all right. So I guess I'm sharing my screen, although I can't see it on my side of what I'm sharing exactly. So is it the presentation?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry about that. I don't know why I can't see it. So anyway, currently, we don't have a lot of guidance in our consulting, in our culture resources manual about consulting party meetings. They are an important part of the process and can really help facilitate a project. Maybe instead of having, you know, a lot of paperwork back and forth and things like that, we want to sit down, discuss things, and a meeting is the most effective way to do it. But right now in our manual, I have a screenshot of essentially what is in our manual, which amounts to 1 page of information. So we realized that this is an area where we could provide some more robust guidance. And so right now what we're working on is an entire chapter that will just be devoted to consulting party meetings. It will be a brand new chapter in part 2 of the manual. And today, we're just going to kind of go over, you know, kind of why we're doing the manual and a high level overview of it, not like the step-by-step instructions that are going to be in there. That will be later when we actually publish it. So kind of what precipitated this is, you know, we've seen over the years, sometimes we have insufficient coordination with Cultural Resources Office about when we should have a meeting, what that meeting should be about, how, you know, how to do that. We have lots of times where there's a last minute scramble to get stuff out the door for a meeting. We want to have a 2-week notice when we're having a consulting party meeting. We're finding that, you know, it's throwing things together at the last minute, making sure we have everything and getting that invitation sent out. Ideally, we want to avoid that type of thing happening. Some recent projects, we realized we don't have a requirement for an Outlook or similar email program request to go along with our invitation. So then sometimes attendees forget to show up. They have an email in their inbox saying there's a meeting, but it's not on their calendar. There's not a reminder that goes out. Oftentimes we have technical issues during the meeting that I demonstrated today. Afterwards, sometimes we don't have a follow-up. You know, we don't get the meeting summary prepared and out the door quickly enough, or we just kind of hold the meeting and that's it, and we don't do appropriate follow-up afterwards. So we are drafting a chapter to provide some more step-by-step guidance on conducting a consulting party meeting, what our expectations would be before, during, and after the meeting. So this is just on the screen as a draft of our table of contents of what we intend to put in this chapter, what we're working on right now, you know, the sections that we're formulating of the chapter. Again, the intent today isn't to provide this for you and you take notes and say, okay, I gotta, you know, cram all this in and know it and start using it. This is what we're working on right now. And so we were just kind of wanting to give people a heads up. This is what we're formulating. See areas that you all might want clarification or more information about so that we can incorporate that as we're developing. So this is, again, our draft table of contents. What I'll focus on a little more today is we will have an appendix that will have a checklist for consulting party meetings. And that checklist is kind of broken down into 3 sections: pre-meeting, during the meeting, conducting the meeting, and then post-meeting. So these are kind of some of the things that we are planning on hitting on, the procedures and steps of coordinating with culture resources about when and we need a meeting, the intent of the meeting, how many meetings. Sometimes on complex projects, we're going to have more than one consulting party meeting. On other times, we can combine it all into one meeting. And then, you know, what do you do when you want to set that date? How do you coordinate with culture resources, and how do we get the other agencies' information? And then when we're sending out the invitation, you know, what's going to go in that invitation? What are the things we need to think about providing for people? One thing I'll highlight is we haven't been good about requiring a meeting agenda go out with the meeting invitation, and that is something that we will want to see moving forward. It's only fair that all the consulting parties have an idea of what is going to be discussed when we're going into that meeting so they can prepare as well. Now, that being said, it doesn't have to be a really in-depth detailed agenda, but just at least have an overview of these are the things that we're going to discuss in this meeting. and we want that to go out with the meeting invitation. Again, there's a 2-week notice that we've already been operating with, but just making that clear that we need those things posted to InScope, reviewed by INDOT 2 weeks prior to the meeting invitation going out. And we are going to request moving forward that there is an Outlook or similar email program meeting request that is sent to the agencies and the consulting parties to hold that date, to have a reminder in there that tells them this is when the meeting is. This was actually suggested by the SHPO staff, and I think it's a great idea because it's easy to forget things if we don't have it actually on our calendar, especially when you're dealing with a virtual meeting. Then you can put that information in the request and have the link in there so that they can just go straight to their calendar, pull up the link, join the meeting. And also, something that we haven't maybe been so consistent with in the past is making sure that the meeting presentation is prepared and sent to INDOT for review before the meeting, so we can take a look at it, make sure we're covering all the right points, and if anything needs to be added, tweaked, whatever. And we would like to see that presentation about 1 week prior to the meeting. So we're going to have some details in the manual about conducting the meeting. I mean, some of it's kind of like no-brainer things, but we need to have it out there. We need to show what our expectations are, and currently it's not out there. We want you to prepare for the meeting. If you're holding it in person, make sure all the equipment's there, everything that you need. If you have a sign-in table, what do you need there? If we're still operating during a pandemic, do you need special things there? Things like that. In the manual, we plan to have kind of an overview of what the meeting agenda might look like. This would be contracted or expanded based on what that particular meeting needs to cover. Sometimes you're going to cover the entire 106 process, from the overview of it through looking at mitigation ideas in one meeting. Or other times we're going to break it down, and sometimes you're just going to talk about the APE and the historic property report results, and then maybe another meeting down the line you would be talking about effects and MOA and whatnot. So it's providing an overview of the things that may be discussed, and then you tailor it to your meeting. And then after the meeting, we want to make sure we don't just hold the meeting and walk away and not know what's going on. We do want that meeting summary prepared pretty quickly afterwards so that CRO can review it in a couple days, and we can get it posted to InScope and sent out to the consulting parties about a week after the meeting. SHPO reserves the right not to finish their letter, send us their review letter until they have this information. And it's only fair that they have this information to consider, to refresh their memory about what happened in the meeting while they're providing their comment letter to us and any of the other consulting parties as well. As they're formulating whatever final comments they might want to provide based on that meeting, that they have this information. So we want to make sure that follow-up happens quickly. And then ultimately, the meeting summary or summaries, plural if you have more than one, would be included in the appendix of the 811 documentation when you prepare that later. So we know that one thing that we've all dealt with in regards to meetings in the past year and a half is, the virtual option and learning new platforms and new programs and all of that. And it's just an ever-changing landscape. So in the manual, we're not intending to put out there specific requirements of you must use Teams or you must use Zoom, or this is how you use Teams or how you use Zoom. The minute we would specify anything about some technological program, it's going to get changed. It's ever changing. It's going to be outdated immediately as soon as we would publish the manual. So our intent isn't to prescribe exactly what platform you use, and it's not to provide guidance on how to use it. There's plenty of information out there to help you choose, and there's plenty of training out there as well. But we just want to think about is how easy is the platform going to be if you're going virtual or if you're using a hybrid. What features do you need? What are the things you want to do and accomplish with that meeting? So picking a platform that has the right features and picking a platform that's easy to use. Ideally, the consulting parties are just going to have a link they can click and join a meeting. Some of them are not tech savvy, and you might need to have a call-in option too. So if they just want to call in, they're not going to be looking at a computer. But when they're joining, via a computer, we want it to be very easy, not have to download software or create a username or account and things like that. It needs to be quick and easily accessible for them to join the meeting. And we really would like for those, when we have hybrid meetings, those in person and those on the phone to have pretty much the same experience. And that, they can hear and see and participate fully, whether they're in the room in a hybrid meeting or on the phone, on their computer. So moving forward, a big picture question will be, how much we use virtual and hybrid, even when we can meet in person. It does seem like it's easier to attend and there's less time commitment from the agencies when we have a virtual or hybrid meeting. So moving forward, even if we can meet in person, we still may have those platforms utilized a lot because it's just easier. It's easier to say, yeah, I can block out an hour or two of my time in the day versus 4 to 6 hours because I have to travel somewhere and travel back. So I think we're not going to see virtual and hybrid meetings go away. We're just going to probably see them more, maybe more hybrid, so that if you don't want to travel, it might depend on your project, the level of participation. Like if you have a lot of local consulting parties, maybe it does make sense to meet there locally, or at least have a hybrid option. If the agencies don't want to meet locally, but you can still meet face to face with those local entities. So I think it's something that we'll just need to talk through on your specific projects moving forward, of what the best platform would be, and what's the most effective use of our time and our efforts. So as I said, this is just a very quick overview of the type of information we're planning to put in there. And so then in the meantime, we would definitely welcome any input that people have. Specifically, if there's anybody that wants to talk today about what are some of your experiences hosting and participating in the virtual or hybrid meeting formats, good and bad things that have happened, any tips and pointers you might have, things that we might want to take into consideration as we formulate this chapter in our manual. We would welcome any comments for the next month or so. So through the end of August, you can feel free to email me. If you have ideas, suggestions, or if you have questions, if there's certain things that you specifically hope that we cover, or that you want clarified, please let us know, and we will definitely take that into consideration as we are formalizing, editing, getting this manual ready to be published. So I guess I'll open it up if anybody has anything they would want to share in the chat, or just raise your hands and we can call on you to do that as well.
Mary, I don't know if you see the chat, but Cinder had I think a good idea. She said she finds it helpful to include the meeting agenda in the body of the invite of the letter of the meeting, not just as a link.
Okay. Yeah.
And yeah, I think that's a good idea too, if it's possible. Because then you're not toggling between the invite and opening up an attachment. I think it kind of streamlines it, and yeah, it doesn't require too much savvy. So I think that's a good idea.
One thing I think with these consulting party meetings, we really see them, they're a great opportunity, right, to get everyone together and have a conversation that involves the consulting parties, Federal Highway, SHPO. It's really important to make the most out of them, and I sometimes have heard people, think of them more as like a burden, like we're, making you do all this extra stuff, but really it's an opportunity to move the Section 106 schedule forward, to get that conversation going, earlier. What might occur during a meeting could be a back and forth that, if it just occurred over writing, might take several months of back and forth comment periods, right? So having that meeting and making sure we get, as much conversation during the meeting done as possible can really help expedite the process, actually.
So I see Cinder has commented that they found it's much more effective to send an invitation versus an email that says the date of the meeting with a link. And you know, I agree that sending that invitation really helps. Gets it on the calendar. If you have a reminder set, then it's there. That time is blacked out. They're going to get reminded about the meeting. And so, yeah, we definitely want to see that moving forward, just to make it easier for everybody to remember to be there and make it easy for them.
Are there any other questions, comments? You know, I think like we're doing with the effects letter guidance, or effects report guidance, which we're still working on. You know, we want, this is your opportunity to share, you know, questions, concerns, pointers now, rather than after we've, you know, finished up the guidance and it goes out. I think, you know, doing it this way will hopefully produce, you know, more effective guidance and head off any kind of miscommunications in the future. So yeah, and Mary's posted her email in the chat.
And anybody who has any experiences of things that just went really well, or were disasters, or, you know, any, you know, I think that would be kind of cool to hear those perspectives. Since, you know, the community of people who are hosting and attending these meetings are on here.
I see that Dave Benefiel has a comment, not specifically for consulting party meetings, but regarding the identification of consulting parties for the early coordination and making sure that we have MPOs included. That is something that definitely we check for when we look at early coordination, Section 106 early coordination, and we certainly always try to have the MPO on there. I do believe somebody had informed us that the link that we had provided in our manual didn't work anymore for the MPO boundaries. Dave, you said there's not currently a map that shows them, but I thought maybe we had found another one somehow. But we'll make a note of that to look and see, you know, what we can provide there. But it is definitely in our manual that the MPO should be invited, and that is something we always try to check when we're sending out early coordination, that the MPO is invited to participate in Section 106.
All right, well, I guess if there are no other comments on the consulting party meeting section for right now, we can move on. But if you think of something after the meeting, email Mary. So with that, I think Patrick, oh, we got one question about how to make sure invitations or emails do not get sent to spam or junk mailboxes. I'm not sure, but we do our best, and I think that's really on the consultants to make sure that they have the most up-to-date email addresses. But if that's something we can think about if we have any other pointers, we'll keep that in mind.
Hey,
Unless you,
yeah, I'm just curious, Kirsten or anybody else, have you all had this happen or had any consulting parties or anybody say, oh, I didn't see it, it went in my spam, or so I'm curious to know if this has been a problem for anybody out there. Because if it is a problem, I don't know what the answer is, but there's something to think about. So it is not one, but I haven't heard of it being a problem to this point, but that just I'm not aware of it.
Mm. Yeah, there's I mean, I guess they were dealing somewhat with the limits of email technology, and I mean, what beyond sending a certified letter in the mail, there's only so much we can do. Mary, did you have a thought you wanted to
Well,
jump in
I
on
know
that?
somebody at some point had suggested turning on the read receipt function of your email if you have that in your email program, so that they, I guess, have to reply. I mean, they could still try to ignore that, I guess, as well, but I'm not sure what other options beyond that.
David, I asked if we can require a consulting party to confirm receipt. I think we could ask that, but not sure how effective we would be able to enforce that. I think we have to. Maybe we have to also take into consideration the consulting party, and if SHPO doesn't respond, obviously there's a problem, if we need to reach out. If we think that there could be, if it's an affected property owner, maybe there needs to be additional efforts if we're not receiving a response and there's a chance for an adverse effect or something like that. We might need to take that kind of thing on a case-by-case basis, depending on the level of impacts of a project. But good things to think about and consider as we move forward. So I guess, but we should move on, I think. So Patrick, you want to jump back in and move on with the state historic review process?
Do you see these slides?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep.
I'm not kidding when I say this. There's police walking our neighbor's yard, so I suddenly got to check this out. I'll let you know. City living. I don't know what's going on. Sorry, I'm not trying to be distracted. It's a little disconcerting. All right. I'm not sure if everybody has had the opportunity or is familiar with the state preservation laws and procedures, and we're not here to go through it all and explain in too much detail, but we just thought this was a good opportunity to kind of go over it in a broad way of the state process and how it's set up. And then we have a few folks here that can talk about their experiences, maybe from an agency perspective, a board member's perspective, and then a consultant's perspective. And we do think that with some new funding strategies coming through the pipeline in the state, that there will be more state-funded projects that will be going in front of the State Historic Preservation Review Board. So we do think that while right now we have the dual review that syncs 106 and the state process, and that takes care of our needs, we don't have to go before the review board for most projects. We do think there'll be an increased number of projects that will go before the review board. So here's just we just want to kind of talk about it, and share, a little bit about this process. And so the State Historic Preservation Review Board makes decisions on preservation-related issues, provides public oversight for the division, and this is just lifted from the website. So I'm plagiarizing here. So anything that's here is just really that I just copied and pasted from their website. But the board nominates Indiana properties to the National Register. It also approves funding recommendations for the federal matching grant, reviews applications that could alter historic properties, which is the certificate of approval. And I'll talk about that in a little more. The board members are appointed by the governor by 3-year terms. Different disciplines are represented: archaeology, architecture, architectural history, and so the SHPO serves as the board's chair. And so you can read more about this if you want to go to this website. And that's just really the overview of the review board. And one thing, so the review board does a lot more stuff than just review projects and grant certificates of approval. But the certificate of approval is where you're probably going to go to the review board, and it's why you would. And certificates of approval are required really simply before a historic site or structure owned by the state. So these are state-owned properties that are eligible or listed in the Indiana or state register, and any other property that is listed. So these require, so any of these properties that are maybe altered, demolished, or removed and by a project funded in whole or part by the state requires a certificate of approval. So it has to be state-owned, eligible, or listed. So what this does not include are just eligible properties. So it is well, I guess it is quite more narrow collection of what we would encounter then in 106. So it's a smaller pool of properties. So that's one thing to keep in mind. The other thing to keep in mind is that it requires state funding. So an LPA project with this just local funding with federal highway participation does not go to the state review board. But once you've got that state part, even if like in the federal process, even if it's $1, then you're going to be looking at getting a certificate of approval. And one thing to keep in mind is that this is a key thing. The review board only meets quarterly. So when you know a certificate of approval is required, you have to plan that out. And this is very important because they only meet quarterly, and the applications are due. There is a deadline when applications are due. They're due 40 days prior to the date of the board meeting. So really planning is going to be crucial when you are going to need a certificate of approval. Now, we do have a mechanism, and this is a tool that we have, it's the dual review. And so this syncs the 106 and state law process. So when we have 106, when we are already going through that 106 process, we can combine that state law process with it. And when the dual review applies, it's really simple. It's in review project, those exact words, in the subject line of the correspondence. And I think we also there's a blurb you could put in the text also that this is a dual review project. And so the request should come as early as you know that the dual review that there's the possibility, that the dual review is needed. So that could be made with the early coordination letter. And so if you know there's something there, a listed property or a state-owned eligible, plug that in your dual review, your early coordination letter. Just plug it in there. Let's get the process started, and that'll signify to DHPA, hey, we're going to start that process. We're going to start including those review board members on the correspondence. And in occasions where we don't know, then we might wait and do the dual review with report distribution letter for the HPR or archaeology report. And in that case, we're still, and even though we've already done the early coordination letter, we're still going to broaden out who gets that. And DHPA is going to make sure that those review board members will be getting that correspondence. And so just some key points. When you need a certificate of approval, remember your deadline, your timeline deadlines. Review board only meets quarterly. If no Section 106 is involved, it's a state and or local process. Consult with interested parties similar to consulting parties. And so in the state process, they're called interested parties, but we treat them similar to consulting parties. Same people, reach out the same way. You want to be a broad net, cast a broad net. And I think Sarah Everhart will talk a little bit more about her experiences with this process in a minute. And then also develop with those interested parties. And that consultation, just like in the 106 process, is key. And the review board wants to see that consultation take place and wants to see how that developed and what that mitigation looks like based on that consultation. And be flexible, ready to negotiate, and this even means on the spot. If you want your certificate of approval granted at that review board, be ready to negotiate, because sometimes interested parties will come to the review board, suggest more different mitigation. The review board might suggest more different mitigation. So be ready to talk, to negotiate if you want that granted that day. And so that's just a really broad overview. And Sarah's going to talk a little bit more about her experiences as a consultant. But I wanted to throw it to Ann Shaw, who is on the review board, and see if, Ann, you wanted to talk about, in general, your perspectives and experience being a review board member. What's it like? What's the time commitments for you, and what's it look like behind, on your side of it as a review board member?
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay. So I've been on the review board since 2019, and I am filling a spot for a historic archaeologist. I am also an architectural historian, so I'm kind of in a dual role, not officially on the board, but just kind of in practice. As far as time commitment goes, that can be kind of a big thing every quarter. We review all National Register nominations before we talk about them in the meeting. If there's any COAs, which are sometimes really huge and sometimes small, we are tasked with reviewing those as well before the meeting, so we know what we're going to be talking about in the meeting. Not a lot of times, sometimes meetings can be very contentious, as Patrick mentioned. There could be times where local interested parties do not want to see the project move forward, or they're not happy with the mitigation that has been suggested. So as Patrick said, there's been quite a few times where mitigation has been changed, or come up with new mitigation kind of on the fly. Sometimes the review board will suggest mitigation measures themselves. So that makes a big difference sometimes. I think one of the hardest parts of being on the review board is having to vote for demolition of properties. There's been a few times where we've had to vote to allow a property to be demolished that, nobody wants to see that happen. So it is kind of sad, but it is necessary sometimes. So. Does anybody have any questions?
So you might have mentioned this, Ann, but did you do you all meet, or how often do you all meet, like before the review board meeting, to talk about, or do you all have like sidebar conversations about projects, or if it's, or especially big, complicated or contentious projects, is that something you all might discuss, prior to a review board meeting?
I think that can happen. It has not been my experience that has happened, but I am assuming that could happen potentially.
Yeah.
It's hard sometimes to sit in a meeting, when you haven't discussed things with the other members of the review board, just to get their ideas and what they're thinking about and how they might vote.
Yeah. And I appreciate your all's role, because I know it has to be hard when, especially when it's contentious and, you have a lot of different viewpoints being thrown at you all, and you all have to kind of be able to sort this out, talk, kind of, figure how to do it, and make those calls. And so I know that's tough, especially if you haven't, it's coming to you right then on the spot.
It is hard. It's very hard, because you don't want to see people upset, and you don't want them to lose anything in their communities or important properties that everybody finds significant,
Yeah, no, yeah, I know it's tough.
Yeah.
Well, oh, go ahead.
When we had to vote on whether to allow demolition of the building at the deaf school in Indianapolis, the room was just packed with supporters from the deaf school who didn't want to see their building torn down, but there was just no mechanism for saving the building. They just could not find it. So, I think the principal of the deaf school got up and spoke, and it was so emotional. And I think there were several members of the board and lots of people in the audience who were just in tears by the time he was done. But in the end, the building could not be saved. So we had to vote to let it be demoed.
Yeah. What do you enjoy or like about being on the board?
I think it's a real honor. I think, hearing about and reading about the National Register nominations, and, we really do have a lot in Indiana. I have heard that we are one of the top states to push National Register nominations to the National Park Service. And I think that's awesome. So it's a real honor for me, and I'm really happy to be able to vote all of those National Register nominations forward to DC.
And you wear, well, I know you wear a bunch of hats, professional, but you also a consultant who does 106. And I'm wondering too, like, if seeing that side of it, well, there's the COA part of it, but is seeing all these national registers come through, if that might impact how you view your job, or how you would do your job when you're, working on 106. Because you're seeing everything in the whole, you're seeing a lot of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm wondering too, like how if you see that bleeding into your 106 hat, world, like, or having that perspective out, that you're getting there.
Yeah, I think it's interesting to sort of be on both ends of the spectrum. I personally don't really do a lot of National Register nominations or COAs. So it's pretty easy for me to separate those things, but I think it's also helpful that I am in Section 106 and I know those processes. There's several members of the board who fulfill like a legal role, or they fulfill an architecture role. They're not used to the Section 106 process. They have no idea how it works, which is good to have outside perspective, but it's also good to have people who know how things go in Section 106.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. Yep. If there's anybody, I don't know, Chad or anybody from DHPA, and you don't have to, but if anybody on there from DHPA wants to say anything about the review board or the process or anything that you feel like you've noticed that helps the process or tips or things not to do, well, you could feel free to say that now too, but no pressure, but
I'm not sure I have a lot to offer, different than what you or Ann have stated today. I guess just a few things that I would briefly mention, which I think kind of came through your prior explanation, but the one key difference with the certificate of approval is that it's a permit. Different than Section 106, it's still consultative in a way, but the ultimate process, rather than just being a consultative one of receiving comments and taking impacts or effects into consideration, in the case of the C of A, it's an actual permit that you're applying for and trying to receive from the Indiana Historic Preservation Review Board. And as such, when conditions are placed on that permit or an applicant maybe suggests or recommends possible conditions or mitigative measures, which maybe they've developed in consultation with local entities and historical interest and local parties and others, they need to be concrete and definitive, ultimately, that when the permit or the C of A is issued, they will be more concrete than what we're typically used to seeing in, say, a memorandum of agreement, which resolves a federal Section 106 adverse effect. Where perhaps things are, we will receive a comment from someone on the final plans, or we will try to take those comments into consideration, or things like that. With the C of A, the same kind of condition would be something much more concrete, similar to saying that the final plans will be approved by DHPA or by a certain, other consulting party or entity, that things shall be done specifically, versus just saying, we will attempt to do this or that. So that's really the one, I guess, maybe major difference that you see, at least in terms of how the mitigative aspects or the conditions placed on receiving that certificate of approval. Some other things that I think you guys had also mentioned is just the importance of coordinating with local parties. I think that's really been one of the distinguishing factors, I think, for many of the applications that we've seen come before the board over the last number of years, is that the applicants that have put in that legwork, put in that early work of really talking to local entities and statewide nonprofits like Indiana Landmarks and their local historical interest, and really building up support for a project, or at the very least making sure that people are well informed and listening to their thoughts and their ideas about it, and really trying to find ways to resolve those concerns and evidence that in their application, they have a much smoother hearing. They're much more likely to get their C of A out the gate, maybe even at the first meeting, versus having it be tabled or have it continued for several meetings later before ultimately being able to receive it or having it denied. And it really makes that difference, because as the board is sitting there trying to, and you can certainly speak to this if I'm over speaking on this, that it's my impression those members are really looking to see whether this has been vetted, whether they've actually worked out these issues with local parties, because the opinions of those closest to it and those with an interest in historic resources, those will also be taken into consideration by board members in deciding whether or not to approve or deny a request. And so I think occasionally there's been some situations where an application came before the board and that work wasn't put in. And in some cases, it seemed like they were almost like trying to just go to the board and not talk to too many people about this. And that didn't work well for those applicants. Because they were basically then told, well, I have these people here showing up to the board that are very concerned about this or feel like they've not been made part of this process or have not had an opportunity to participate. You need to go back and work with these folks and come back here another day, and then we'll see where we're at. So certainly you'd want to document those efforts at consulting and talking to others and holding public meetings depending on the size and scope of the project, and show how you're addressing those concerns and attempting to minimize impacts as part of your proposals for mitigating when you're putting together that application for the certificate. Some other things that we always kind of look at least as staff to the board here at DHPA, as we're reviewing applications and trying to work with applicants to get their application ready for prime time, as we like to say, or to go to the board, is to try to anticipate what the board members would want to see. What would they need to know in order to make an informed decision? Are there holes in this or questions that are unanswered, and can you provide that information or provide that support for why this action needs to happen or why the project needs to be done this way, or why these historic resources would need to be altered or demolished or removed for this project versus doing the project some other way. Certainly another thing that we're seeing increasingly, particularly with some of these newer state-funded projects for road improvements and highway improvements, is it'd really be helpful and really is important to have clarity on what agency is providing the funding and what the funding sources are. And I know that's becoming a more murky area, particularly with some of the different state funds and grants and things that are available. And sometimes there isn't a lot of clarity even with the applicants as to what funding sources they're ultimately going to be able to make use of. But for us to be able to review it and provide the ultimate C of A letter, we have to know what the state agency is that is providing the funding and ultimately is on the hook for compliance with Section 18, because you as the applicant, if you're a consultant or sub-consultant or a city, you're in a sense the delegatee for the state agency, but it's really the state agency that has the responsibility that somebody obtain a C of A for using their state funds in a way that would alter, demolish, or remove a historic resource. Simpler things are just photos, obviously, maps, a clear project description, a description that also really explains how the project will impact historic resources, which may, in some respects, seem kind of odd that that you would want to highlight how your project might be damaging or destroying something. But again, we need to know that as part of the application, and the board members need to know that, so we really can understand what this project will do and what those impacts will be that they're ultimately going to be approving or denying, or say forming conditions on how it might be done. And so if that's not real clear in the application materials, then that also just leaves a big question mark as to what's really going on here, and why this is coming to the board, and exactly what would actually be happening in this neighborhood or in this city, or you know, how this project really is affecting or impacting these historic structural or archaeological resources. Patrick already talked about the difference between listed and eligible, and how the state law in this regard for certificates of approval, that they're required for listed or eligible resources, historic resources that are state-owned, and listed resources if they're not state-owned. The other thing that we ask, frequently ask and see, is we are contacted sometimes by consultants and others that are planning a project and know that they're going to be using some state funds, and they want to know whether or not they'll need to apply for a C of A. And we often, for consistency, and also I guess to create perhaps a stronger, better file for them and for us, ask that they just go ahead and put the information on a C of A form, even if it's maybe not as fully fleshed out as you might want to actually take it to a board meeting. But even if we're going to ultimately issue an exemption letter, the mechanism for doing so is to go ahead and send us a C of A form, and then we'll write you a letter back and say, well, in this case, you do not have a historic resource in your project area, so therefore you're exempted from getting a C of A, just as an example. And then of course you'd have the other situations where you do, and in fact, maybe you are adversely impacting a resource, so therefore you're going to be going to the board to seek that certificate of approval. And then finally, I was just going to briefly just mention, in terms of dual review, I can't emphasize enough the importance of trying to coordinate early on that, and to let us know as early as possible that you are intending to do a dual review. A dual review being, of course, when you have both federal and state funding, that if we are told late in the process, then there really is that risk of two things. One is that you'll have to do a lot of backing up to get all the interested parties on board and aware of what's going on, including the Indiana Historic Preservation Review Board members, so that they can participate in that consultation, which really is the means by which we're allowed under that rule to say that the federal review also satisfies the state review requirement. If people are brought in very late and they're not able to participate fully in that federal review process, then really the federal process is not satisfying the state process for that purpose. And there would then be that risk that we'll simply deny it and say, no, we do not believe that the dual review satisfied both the state and the federal processes. You will still need to get a C of A. So we haven't had one like that yet, but again, I just would highly encourage that if you're going to do a dual review, or you believe that you'll be using state funds, to try to start coordinating that and let us know that it'll be a dual review as early as possible, so that certainly we can make sure collectively, our agency and you as the applicant and the project sponsor, that we're involving all the people that need to be involved, including the review board members, so that they can participate in that federal review and feel like they were included and can be part of that, so that that would satisfy both the state and the federal law requirement.
The only thing that I would add to what Chad said is similar to what Mary was talking about for consulting party meetings. You know, how many meetings you're going to have should be commensurate with how complex the project is. It's worked really well for large, complex projects to plan an initial project introduction for the review board before they ever submit materials. Just to sort of let everybody know this is coming. This is, you know, what we think the impacts are going to be. Just to involve and engage and coordinate early. So we've seen some pretty successful outcomes for projects that have put that planning step in there. I know that can lengthen the time period again because the review board meets quarterly. But something that you might consider if you have a large complex project. So that's really all I would add. But also to thank Anne for being a member of the review board. I don't think Patrick necessarily mentioned this, but review board is totally voluntary. Our board members don't receive any sort of compensation for their time and their efforts that they put in for all the projects. And we certainly appreciate their expertise and advice on those matters. So thanks, Anne.
Yeah, thanks, Ann. That's a good point. It's voluntary. One thing, you all kind of, we've kind of touched on it, but I think there might be sometimes a perception that going to the review board, like if you just only have state money and not federal, that it's easier. And I hope you get from today, like it is not necessarily easier to go to the review board if you don't have 106 in lieu of 106, and it actually can be more complicated. And actually, you know, it can be just as time consuming because you're still going to go through that, you know, what Beth was saying about meeting with folks, and you might have several meetings. And of course, the review board meets quarterly. And as Chad mentioned, also, it acts as a permit. And so that review board really has the yes and no approval. You know, they have that ability, whereas 106 is really going through this process. And if you follow the process, you're going to get out on the other side. And so, yeah, it is not a get out of jail free card or anything, you know, like that. If you don't have federal highway participating, it is, can be just as involved and complicated and long. So just keep that in mind. And one other thing I want to touch on real quick on our side, on INDOT side of it, similar to when we, you know, need to get 106 done before the NEPA document, we do that certificate of approval granted prior to the state environmental process. So if we're only talking about the state and no federal, you know, we're still going to do that state level environmental document. So we really want that certificate of approval granted prior to the approval of the state environment. Still have to line up. And so when you're planning your project. And so we've had the agency perspectives and the review board members' perspectives. And so I know Sarah Everhart works at Structure Point, and she's had a couple really good projects, really interesting projects. So I was going to let Sarah talk about her side of it, like her experiences and what she can offer as tips and tricks and lessons learned, maybe.
Well, I mean, it seemed like everyone covered some of my lessons learned already. So we went in front of the review board recently for the State Road 32 Westfield reconstruction project, which if anyone is or isn't familiar with it, it's a very large, complex project. So it was a partnership between INDOT and the city of Westfield to widen State Road 32 through downtown Westfield, which does have a National Register listed historic district. And the project, which I don't recommend doing this, but the project started off with federal funding. And then about halfway through the Section 106 process, INDOT switched their side to state funding. So then we were out of doing 106 and solely going for COA approval. So like Patrick said, the 106 process can be lengthy itself, but the COA process can be just as lengthy. Applying for it and getting the actual COA permit, it can only be a few months just from applying to getting it, depending on the project, but a lot of it is the front-loaded work that goes into it. We found that we put just as much time or more time into it because it was now 100% state funded. As far as putting together documentation, I can't even count how many interested parties meetings we had. Chad attended a lot of them, so he probably remembers them fondly. So yeah, you're still going to probably put in about the same amount of effort unless you have a very simple project. And one of the things like they talked about is significant is the coordination. You really need to make sure that you're coordinating with those interested parties, especially the people that would appear at the review board meeting, not only for the typical reasons, but just to make sure that you're reaching some kind of compromise or consensus and identifying any issues ahead of time. So it's something that you can address before going in front of the review board. Sometimes you can't get everyone to agree, which we experienced, but at least putting that effort forth and trying to get everyone, and it's a really good faith effort and shows the review board that you tried to find some kind of consensus or compromise. The other thing is for a larger project, which Beth already mentioned, we did do an introduction to the review board because we had been 2 years into that project between 106 and everything else. We had done a full alternatives analysis and everything as well. So we ended up, luckily Beth and Chad and Paul, they were great through this process and we appreciate it because they talked to us all the time and helped us through. We put together a project information packet and kind of explained the project to date and all the effort that we put into it and kind of the reasoning for the project, some of the avoidance and minimization we'd already done, the alternatives analysis, which by the end it was a very long packet, long report and letter, but we requested to make that appearance in front of the review board, and we did go in front of them and make like a small presentation. And we did it mostly so if they had any questions or if there was any issues identified earlier that they had problems with, it's something that we could start looking at now and maybe address that before we did our application. We felt it really helped. I don't know if Anne thinks so, I don't know. But it was something that at least we could put our faces in front of everyone and they could be aware the project was coming up, especially because it was so large, complex, and controversial. So I don't know if anyone really touched on the format of these meetings. The meetings are much more formal, and really what it comes into is, which Chad might be able to speak better on it, but they go through the nominations and things, and when they get to a COA application, Chad introduces the project. He reads staff recommendations, which hopefully they're short. Sometimes they're longer, and Chad has to go through a lot of reading. And then people are given the chance to speak. So what we did and how we approached it is because as the applicant, at least from what we understood, we weren't guaranteed a chance to stand up and speak about the project. We made sure that we submitted a card noting that we wanted to speak. And we did get to speak first and kind of give a brief summary of the projects and kind of talk about the different details. And we also liked it because then we could introduce the project team. So we typically, like I was the main spokesperson, but we had our engineers, our other environmental people, our INDOT and City of Westfield there. So we made sure to introduce them because in the end, if there were questions, it was most likely that other people would have to help answer them along with me, which we ended up tag teaming some questions of, especially engineering questions, which aren't my area, and passing them off to each other. And then after we spoke, anyone else who submitted a card to speak or give their comments or opinions, they were allowed to get up and give their opinions. And I think the big thing about that is that when they do that, it's not necessarily given that the project team will get to rebuttal anything they say, whether that we agree with it or we don't agree with it. So that's also something that you have to think about and make sure those issues that had come up previously you've addressed or at least tried to address and convey that to the board in a way. And the review board does ask questions, and well, if something's confusing to them or someone says something and has a comment and then it makes them question something about the project, they'll ask us to stand up and answer as best we can. And like Patrick said, you will be changing things on the fly. We were on the fly changing mitigation commitments and wording and kind of going back and forth on those things. So you do have to be prepared to know what your limits are, what you're okay with, what you're not okay with. Make sure your INDOT and if it's an LPA or whoever is this project sponsor show up to have those on the spot conversations. Because things will change, or if they don't change, you won't get the COA. And then one of the other things is not only support from interested parties, but make sure you have support from like an LPA. Say it's only an INDOT project through an LPA. Generally, there's already support by it, but I know that we found from other projects that having those people show up to the meetings and give their support for the project really helps to make sure that the review board knows the community supports it, whether that be a mayor, a city council, and even if it's just local business leaders from the community. We had a lot of people who necessarily weren't involved with the project or weren't being directly impacted show up to show their support or at least give their opinions on the project. And the final thing, and the reason why this might be really important is Patrick asked me to touch on this as well, is that the Indianapolis MPO right now is doing a federal funds exchange program. And what that is, and they've been working on this and guidance just recently came out for it, is that they are exchanging all the federal funds they get from INDOT for state funding. So a lot of projects now are going to be completely state funded, and depending on their impacts, they may be required to get a COA. So potentially there could be a lot more COAs coming through for these transportation projects. And I think that guidance is up on the Indianapolis MPO's website, and I believe they're going to start that for fiscal year 2025 projects. So there's information out there, and they just kind of rolled this out. So I think there's still a lot of questions, but it's just something to be aware of that everyone will probably start seeing a lot more state funded projects. Does anyone have any questions about our experience going through the COA process?
I wanted to say one thing, Sarah, while anybody thinks of questions, but you touched on this, and I think this is really important. If you're representing an LPA or whatever project you're working on, don't go alone. You know, like have a support system there at the review board, have the project manager there, have an engineer there who can answer those design questions or who can answer those questions about, because let's say the review board comes out and says, well, what can you add this mitigation? And of course, this mitigation costs money, in a lot of cases. And so you want those people there that can make those decisions, because you might not be the person who can make those decisions. So have a support team with you. You can have, like Sarah, took the lead in the presentations and facilitating that. But, like she said, when there were design questions or questions about, some of that mitigation that, she would defer to those other people there. So just don't go it alone. Have that support, have those people that can help answer questions or make decisions with you.
Yeah, and speaking of mitigation, I think Chad touched on this earlier too. We did do lengthy mitigation conditions for the COA. And this is where project planning and timelines come in, is because of how all this funding switched around and kind of we were coming up against a schedule as well. There was a lot of unknowns that we couldn't figure out just on the fly or in one meeting with interested parties concerning mitigation, even as far as like plans or how money was going to be spent on some portions of the project, plans for how to relocate a building. So we did have a little less concrete mitigation, which did cause us a little bit more issues during those meetings and trying to discuss that and figure that out with interested parties and the review board. So the biggest thing is to plan your time. I mean, it took us at least a year to year and a half probably to get through the change to state funding, have additional meetings and work through kind of mirroring the 106 process, which benefited us for the scenario. But it did take significant time. And I think we had 4 or 5 official meetings and probably 8 or 9 in the end with interested parties of going back and forth. And I think we had a couple, like 2 or 3 in like a 2-month period trying to work through mitigation. So trying to make sure you get that mitigation as concrete as you can before you approach the review board is probably good. Granted, there's things that you can't always get definitive, but that does help if you do that. And meeting minutes. Keep meeting minutes of all your meetings because then you can send them to Chad and he hopefully, if he's feeling gracious that day, will share them with the review board.
Now, I was just going to add that, well, backing up a little bit, in some cases, there are presentations as well. Like you had mentioned about being able to speak during, as the applicant being able to speak during the meeting. For some of the more complex projects, well, you guys came in and did a prior presentation. That's not always necessary. Again, it just depends on the complexity and size and how controversial the project might be. So for example, yours, you did that. You had a presentation before actually bringing the C of A, and ended up having to come back a 3rd time to actually obtain the C of A. But as an example, we had another project just this last meeting for a extension of Pleasant Street in Noblesville, and that was a one and done. Less controversial. There was, I think, much more broad-based support within the community for it. It wasn't, again, I think it just wasn't quite as controversial within the community of, having a lot of, half the community for it, half the community against it or something like that, as, some projects just happen to take on more of that characteristic. But I was also going to mention that I don't have the pleasure of giving the staff comment at every meeting. Typically, as our staff works, our office works, whoever the reviewer is for that C of A will provide the comment, or one of the 2 reviewers. So just throwing that in there. So you won't always get to see or hear me drone on and on.
Well, hopefully not as many projects are that long.
I hope we haven't scared everybody off about this, but it's the reality, right? This is what it looks like. Does anybody have any, before we move on, does anybody have any questions for Sarah or Chad or anyone else about this topic? And feel free, if you think of questions later, I think anybody would be open to, answering questions. And and of course, Cultural Resources, we're here to help too. So, all right. Well, I think we'll move on. But thank you, Ann and Beth and Chad and Sarah. We appreciate your time and your insights. Thank you. And Anthony, I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, so we just have a few minutes left. So we just had some odds and ends and some things hopefully we'll maybe get to in another virtual chat. But odds and ends include a quick reminder that trail projects need to have logical termini, independent utility, all of those things. We've been running into a large amount of problems with trail projects recently. They kind of seem innocuous, and we love trails. I use trails all the time, but they still need to follow all the NEPA requirements if they're getting federal highway money. So that's a quick reminder. In the future, we, in conjunction with the Environmental Policy Office, might hold a segment, virtual chat segment on that topic. Another quick reminder is to contact us when there's post 106 changes that might require reopening the section 106 process. So if there's any changes after 106 is done, contact us. Don't assume necessarily that you know what is required, because every case is different. We really approach it on a case-by-case basis. And so as soon as you can, let us know, contact us, and we'll get back to you with the appropriate level of recoordination, whether that's a note to file, or it's a letter to consulting parties, or if we just have to go back and reopen the whole process. So let us know. Last major point is that some of you might be aware that it seems like we've been having a number of eligibility issues, disagreements, back and forth on projects with SHPO. And you know, that's going to happen sometimes. But I do think it's been happening more recently, over the past year, couple years. So just FYI, I think we will want to return to this topic, particularly with regard to both farms and post-war subdivisions. That's something to keep in mind, is that we've been having disagreements, and I think that it's an issue that consultants need to keep in mind when they scope projects. The shard is not necessarily going to be the best predictor of whether SHPO views these properties as eligible, is our one of our takeaways. And so that's an evolving discussion that we're having, but it's something that we want people to keep in mind, that we may be asking for additional information about these properties, even if we don't necessarily, it's not to say that we necessarily think they're eligible, but we're concerned that SHPO may not agree with us, or may request additional information in order to make an eligibility determination. So we want to get ahead of that and provide that additional information as soon as possible. Mary, Patrick, did I cover that eligibility disagreement issue? Do you have anything to add on that?
No, I think that's fair. I think it's just, giving people a heads up, because I know, I've on a couple HPRs recently asked the consultant, hey, could you provide a little bit more for your justification here? So it's just kind of giving that background of where we're coming from, because we just, if we anticipate those questions are going to come later, we might as well go ahead and address it early on in the HPR, of providing whatever extra information we anticipate the SHPO may want to see.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, we try to anticipate these things, and that's why it's, sometimes, we are asking for more information, and it's so that SHPO can, that we can get one review and a concurrence, if possible. Anthony, do you see Chad's?
Yeah. So the first question, Chad asks whether LPA trail projects that occur partially along a state road within a listed historic district require a COA. He says, seems like the answer would be yes. Well, the first question is, does the project involve state funding? Because if it's just federal highway funding and local funding, and INDOT is just providing the administrative oversight that we do for 106, then no state review is required. If it's an LPA project that's receiving state funding, and it's installing multi-use path in a historic district. I don't know how many blanket statements we can make about what level of coordination it would require, but it sounds to me like that would need probably a COA application in that case. Does that sound right, Patrick? You have more experience with these COA applications.
Yeah, I think the key, and if you keep in mind that it's the nexus is whether you have state funding, and so if you have state money in a project, whether an INDOT project or some collaboration between the state and an LPA, which we're going to see more of, it looks like, then that's really your first thing. Like, is it state funded? And then are there properties eligible, state-owned properties that are eligible? And then are there just listed properties? And so start with your funding and then go from there.
So Chad says it's a federal aid LPA project. Well, then it wouldn't require a COA or a COA application. No.
All right. Yep.
Well, we're right at 1:30. So last call for questions or comments.
Hey, this is Wade Tharp with the SHPO's office. I had one quick comment on 2 quick points.
All right.
And these are both actually just kind of minor things for trail projects. I think it's gotten better in the past couple of years, but it's always helpful if, especially with trail projects that are, in corridors, old rail corridors, that everybody's aware that, are there still elements of the rails or the ties or other, elements or depots or whatever that could be archaeological. So it's always helpful when that stuff is kind of known and put up front rather than, we get a short report from the archaeologist or an opinion from an archaeologist saying there doesn't appear to be anything there, and then we kind of look at maps and say, well, is this in a rail corridor? It looks like there could still be areas. So it's always helpful when that stuff is kind of up front, and also with whoever's doing the HPR, the architectural historians, if it's possible and appropriate, I guess coordinate with INDOT and the other consultants, especially if they're in-house. It seems like this would be a lot easier. To the people preparing the HPR reports, always talk to the archaeologists and kind of let them know if you've found anything that could be of interest. So they're not, they're not just relying on maybe their own library research or records check. Sometimes the HPR will have things that the archaeologists maybe aren't aware of or don't have access to. That's all. Thank you.
Thanks, Wade. Well, anything else to add? Nope. All right. Well, it's been great hearing from you all and talking with you all. And again, please email us as always with your suggestions, comments, questions, feedback. We welcome that, and stay tuned for updates on our next virtual chat.
Thank you, everybody. We appreciate it.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.